Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today we are talking about vaccines. Specifically, who will take the coronavirus vaccine when it's finally ready. Joining me to discuss are Israeli attorney and legal advisor for Meshilut, Simcha Rotman, and attorney and political analyst Ran Bar Yoshafat. But first, to begin, pharmaceutical company Pfizer and its German biotech partner are now announcing a proven 90% efficacy rate in their latest phase 3 vaccine trials. And Israel is, of course, trying to get a piece. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirming advanced talks with Pfizer to acquire millions of doses of their new drug.
היום זה יום מאוד חשוב במאבק העולמי בקורונה. חברת פייזר הודיעה שיש יעילות של 90% בחיסון שהם פיתחו. להערכתי, גם כמה חברות אחרות מתקדמות ליעד זה, גם אנחנו מתקדמים. בחיסון שלנו זה עוד ייקח זמן. אבל דבר אחד ברור, לא רחוק היום, זה לא עוד שנים, זה עוד חודשים, שיהיו חיסונים שהם יהיו זמינים לאוכלוסיית העולם. היעד שלי כרגע הוא לעשות דבר אחד, להביא חיסונים לכם, אזרחי ישראל. ואנחנו נעשה את זה.
Well, shining the light at the end of the tunnel, but the only problem now is in the administration of the vaccine. Health Ministry Director General Professor Chezi Levi saying that he'd like to promote a law that would oblige otherwise healthy individuals to be vaccinated, and that he's already in dialogue with legal counsel on how to do this. Simcha, I want to begin with you. Is there any way that Professor Levi can actually get that done?
Of course, with laws you can do everything, but having this kind of law is problematic because it hurt the autonomy of a person. It's the court many times says that autonomy has a high level protection from laws. You can finally see the reason to make this kind of law, but some people can ask themselves, do you really need to have this kind of obligation? We know that other kind of vaccines, most of the population in Israel is quite unique compared to the world. On other kind of vaccines, very high rate of the people here are vaccinated. The children here are vaccinated in much more than most countries around the world. Very high percentage of the population is vaccinated in other kind of vaccines. Why would you want to have this kind of obligation? Usually, the preferred method of pressuring the population to get the vaccines is through other means. You can say, if you have a badge that you got the vaccines, you can get into the mall without a check. You can get maybe lower prices on a certain kind of insurance. Maybe you can get all kinds of benefits from it. It's better to use the carrot than the stick in this matter, and it raises less constitutional problems to make this kind of obligation.
Ran, I want to bring the same question to you. Why, or rather, can Israelis be forced to vaccinate?
I hope that the answer will be no, but what you can have is sanctions and, giving different benefits for those who are vaccinated. And I think that will be a better solution. I just want to say, because I do want to make it a little bit more political, it is interesting that while in America, usually it's the hard right that opposes vaccination and doesn't take corona very seriously, I think in Israel in general, the right side of the political map takes corona very seriously, and it's actually the far left that is very, I would say almost ignoring the risks of corona. But I think that we cannot hurt, you cannot hurt individual freedoms in general, and I don't think corona is that of an exception for that. However, you can have all sorts of limitations. For instance, if your son or daughter did not get a vaccine, then they cannot go to this or that school. Or if you want to fly somewhere abroad, then it will be something that's an obligation to get a vaccine before that. That is very possible. And I think that's how human beings usually interact with each other. It's a matter of sanctions and incentives. So if you have that, you don't really need a law that forces people to get a vaccine. That, I think, in my opinion, be a violation of individual freedoms.
Well, so that's it. I want to take maybe the opposite approach and pose it this way, that on the one hand, you could say, incentivize getting a vaccine, say maybe some sort of tax benefit or a prize of some sort, but taking away certain things like access to a shopping venue or other punitive actions or sanctions, wouldn't that be a violation of individual civil liberties?
I think not, because the fact that when a person goes unvaccinated and he doesn't have any health reasons, you have to remember that some people might be allergic to the vaccine, some people cannot take vaccines because they have cancer or some other disease that they cannot take it. So if you go unvaccinated, you are not only hurting yourself, it's not only a choice you're doing for yourself, you're putting some other people in risk. Also, today, there are some kinds of diseases that we already thought that we are gotten rid of them, and people without an active immune system put in danger and sometimes die because someone who thought that vaccination is not safe or something didn't take his vaccines, and basically killed them. So it's not only about your rights and you're hurting other people. Again, I don't say that you cannot force people to vaccinate. All the question is the danger, the effectiveness, but I just think the more reasonable approach, and I think that the way that it will work more easily and also pass the constitutional test, not only in the courts, but also in the Knesset, and the objection from the people in the Knesset. You don't need the court to say that something is unconstitutional. People say it in their day-to-day life. I think that to use this kind of incentives and to use this kind of sanctions will be much easier to pass in legislation, and it will be even more effective.
All right, well, sticking with the rhetoric of forcing or obliging citizens to vaccinate, how would that be accomplished in the courts? Ran?
That's the million-dollar question, not just for vaccinations. I think that at the end of the day, I don't see the Knesset really passing a law that forces people to get a vaccine. If the Knesset passes such a law, I think it will be a fair claim to take it to the Supreme Court and say, this is a very harsh violation of individual freedoms. However, I have no idea how the court will rule because, unfortunately, I think that the Israeli Supreme Court doesn't always follow the norms that the majority of the Israeli society believes in. But again, I think that the main question is not what is the right thing to do in general. I think that if there will be a proper vaccination for corona, I know I will definitely take it once I know it's safe. But I think that the question is how much am I allowed to force someone else? And I think that the reasonable answer is to say, yes, if you're not taking the vaccine, I will not allow you to participate in my events. My events can be a private school, a private kindergarten, it can be a certain gym, it can be, a certain shopping mall, and so on and so forth. That person can still go to an open area, to a certain public garden. But I think it makes a lot of sense to say if you have a disease and you're a threat to others, then you will have sanctions that you will have to suffer from. And I think that the best example will be flying outside of Israel. It is very normal to say, when people fly from Israel to certain countries, they're obligated to get vaccination to different diseases. It's also, I think, makes a lot of sense to say if you're a person that wants to fly out of the country to leave Israel, you have to be vaccinated.
I think the main question will be not the general idea. It will be in the details. If the vaccine will be 100% effective and have zero effects on the people who take them, and it's 100% safe, then it will be much easier to say, why are you objecting, and maybe use more sanctions and less incentives.
Will that be an argument that can even be made, though? Because we don't know the long-term effects now.
We don't know anything, but we do know the effects of not getting vaccines. Sure. That we do know.
Of course.
But there are ways to check these kind of things. If it's not 100% safe, to oblige someone, to force someone to get a vaccine that might have a chance, maybe 3 in a million, but doesn't matter, that he might die because of that, it's a much harder position for a country, for a state to do to its own citizens.
What about through some sort of emergency powers action similar to the emergency powers awarded to the Shin Bet to monitor Israelis for contact tracing? Is that something that maybe they could maybe the government could circumvent the courts entirely.
There are in the current laws, the laws in Israel concerning dealing with plague, with an outbreak of a disease, allow a lot of power to the management, to the general manager of the health minister, has a lot of powers in current Israeli system. He doesn't even need a new law. He can use his own powers to vaccinate people, especially, of course, people who are working for the health system, like no questions asked. But even general population, in the case of an outbreak, he can do basically anything he wants. He can put people in quarantine. He can tell you cannot leave your house if you did not get a vaccine. He can do basically anything in current laws in Israel. Usually, they don't use these powers, and usually when they want to make sure that they get the approval of the Knesset to this kind of measures. But the abilities, the authorities, already there.
Now, Ran, you mentioned earlier some of the long-term effects and how you would be the first to sign up for a vaccine were it proven safe. Now, I know none of us here are doctors on this panel, but we don't know, like I mentioned, we don't know yet any of the long-term effects, whatever they may be, of a vaccine, of a potential vaccine. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that there are some harmful effects and Israel were to be liable, you could say, or responsible for bringing that iteration of the vaccine to the public. Are we seeing a massive, are we looking towards a future massive class action lawsuit against the Israeli government?
I just want to clarify, I didn't say I'll be the first to. I said if I know that it works. I am definitely not going to be the first to. And I also understand that people have some concerns about vaccines in general, not just about COVID vaccine. I do resent the argument that a vaccine will put a chip in my body or something like that. I think that these arguments are ridiculous. But because we don't know enough about COVID or about the vaccine, so I do understand why people will be very, very cautious. And definitely, I don't see a lot of people who want to be the first to be vaccinated. And I think that if the government will force people to get something inserted into their bodies, I think that that is a good legal case to take it to the Supreme Court. Again, I think it will be much smarter for Israel to say, I do not allow you to go into certain places if you have not gotten a vaccine. And in general, I think it's usually better for a government not to use force on its citizens. That's my guide rule. I'm not saying that there aren't any exceptions. A pandemic is definitely an exception. I'm not happy with the fact that the Shin Bet can now monitor people in Israel and tell them that they were next to people that have COVID, but I understand that this is a very unique situation. What I want to make sure is that these powers that the government is having is not something that they're going to have forever. So I'm just saying it is kind of interesting to see that on a political analysis, it's very different between Israel and America, where here the right wing seems to be more tilted towards wearing masks, making sure that you have social distancing and so on and so forth, and promoting the concept of getting a vaccine. Whereas in America, it's the opposite. It's the left that's leaning towards that a little bit more. But again, the main issue here is don't force people, give them sanctions and incentives so they will behave in a proper way. Also, I hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu is correct and that we're not talking about years, but that we're talking about months. We already know, just 1 year since COVID began, basically, we know a lot more about COVID than we did before. So I do hope now that basically all of the world is working it, that we will know more and more, and eventually it will be something that's more easy to deal with.
Again, in Israel, even today, the vaccines for children are not mandatory. We have very high compliance rate in Israel for vaccinations. People are getting vaccines. Even you have some kind more obligatory, less obligatory, but you basically can say, I don't want to. Anyway, most of the people in Israel, most of the children in Israel are getting vaccines. They're getting vaccines against chickenpox. They're getting vaccines about almost anything, because Israel is very the people in Israel. It's also part of the Zionist project. One of the main Zionist project was to get vaccines for children. It was also Hadassah, the health organization in Israel, is part of the Zionist movement. it's very unique in when you compare it worldwide. So I believe if the public in Israel, who has a lot of trust to his health system, and basically some good health system, if we look at it in a world comparison, I believe if there will be an option in Israel, you won't even need to get to that. Most of the people will get a vaccination, like they get for the flu, like they get for the children get vaccinated. I don't think we'll get to the question.
I mean, that being said, I feel like I have to play the devil's advocate to a degree and say, okay, well then, why would Chezi Levi even make these comments in the first place? If you know, the participation rate is high enough, if the culture is there.
I think he's more concerned about specific groups of population that has less compliance, even in children vaccination and in other issues. We saw those problems where were the outbreaks. Generally speaking, sorry for to make this kind of generalization, but we have this data in some areas, in some parts of the ultra-Orthodox community, some parts of the Arab communities. They have less trust in the system than the other groups based on their religion, based on other aspects of their life, doesn't matter. So he might have those groups in mind. And in those groups, we also have the problem of vaccination, of children vaccination. It's basically the same, but the general population is not like that. And when you talk about this kind of pandemic, if you get to 80% or to 70% vaccination around the population, the fact that there are minorities, and we know that this corona in small numbers is not such a terrible disease. When you have it as a pandemic, it's terrible, but when you have it in controlled number, it's not such a terrible disease, then we might not get to that. But of course, as a person who is in charge of the health of the general population and looks at all the groups in Israel, I understand why he would say that.
I see. Now, Ran, I want to come back to you. Legally speaking, again, is there any sort of precedence for what Chezi Levi is discussing?
So I just want to say, sometimes people promote different bills for different reasons. It can be a political motive, or it can even be a real, honest, good intention. I don't know if you remember, but in the beginning, the mask that people were wearing on their face, it cost about 9-10 shekels. Today, it costs between 10 agorot to 30 agorot. That's like less than 25 cents. And there were people in the Israeli Knesset who said, let's make a law that says, in order to be kind for the public, that a mask on your face has to be 3 shekels or 3.5 shekels, about $1. I don't see any of them apologizing now. Sometimes people have good intentions, but the outcome is different. There are different legal cases where the government has the power to force people to do all sorts of stuff. During the Gulf War, people were giving gas masks and were asked to put them on their face. So yeah, you do have the ability, the government has the ability to force people to do things. I'm very happy to say that in Israel, still, it is something that people don't really want to use. Like Simcha Rotman said, right now, the government has the ability to tell people, don't leave your house. There are many means that the government can use force on its citizens. The question is, why? I think that those people who are against vaccination, who think that corona is a hoax and so on and so forth, I think that if the government will force a vaccine on them, it will actually create more conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. Whereas if you talk about incentives and sanctions, I think it will work better. So I think really the question is not the intentions of this MK or that MK trying to promote laws that I really hope that will not pass, and I don't see them passing because, again, in my mind, to force people to get a vaccine in their body is very odd. But I don't think that's the issue. It's not what they had in mind. It's what will actually work and will be better for Israel. So we will have as many people who are healthy and safe as possible.
If you want a reminder from the past, you know that Israel is based on a lot of immigration, about a lot of aliyah, when people came from different countries, bringing all kinds of diseases that were not in here. The government in the 50s and the 60s made a lot of, and it created some trauma to some of the people that came from different countries. And some of it also created a reason for lawsuits. You asked about it before. Israel dealt with some kind of, I don't know the name in the English for this kind of disease, but some kind of a fungal disease that used to be in the people that came from Africa to Israel. So olim from different, so they used X-rays to defeat it. It created even larger damages than the original disease, but the disease does not exist anymore in Israel. But Israel had to compensate the people that got those X-ray treatment. It was the common treatment those days. It happened in the past. I hope we won't. The medicine today in Israel much more sophisticated. We know much more, and the public knows more. So you don't need to use this kind of mechanism when you have an educated population who basically have trust in their medical system and the healthcare system. And I believe, again, you might need it in small areas when there are outbreaks or some areas of non-compliance, but in the general population, I don't think we'll ever need to get to that.
Well, and should anything like that ever happen, the public does have a legal recourse? For example, with this X-ray case that you brought up.
So there was a special law to compensate for that, and the people are still getting compensation from the government on those issues. They got cancer many years after, or some few years after, depends on the case, and they got compensation. But again, who knows what's better? To compensate few people for this kind of treatment, or to have a disease spreading among the population with much more bigger costs and hurting innocent people. So that's kind of decision. I'm happy I'm not the prime minister or the health minister or the general manager of the health ministry to decide.
Well, I think I can second that sentiment, that I'm very happy I'm not in a position to have to make that decision. But unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today to discuss it. Thank you, Ran Bar Yoshafat and Simcha Rotman, for joining us. Tune in next time on Insider for more in-depth analysis on everything Israel. Also, if there's a topic that you want us to cover next, please let us know about it in the comment sections online. And finally, remember that for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV channels. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you for watching.